4 decades ago, when the courts decided Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, it was, intentionally or not, a watershed moment, changing the ways that courts, agencies, presidents, and Congress all went about their work. It also shaped the way we think about those institutions. The full effect of Chevron deference in each of those institutions would not become clear for many years. So too, perhaps, with Loper-Bright. Some of its effects will be immediate and obvious, but some of its effects may not become evident for years. Still, it's not too soon to start thinking seriously about it, and not just Loper-Bright's effects on the courts. In fact, today, our main focus is on the Constitution's other institutions, on Loper-Bright's hydraulic effects in Congress and in the executive branch.
When you have agency leadership that are exceeding their legal authorities, it's particularly unreasonable to also empower them to be the adjudicator of whether or not they're exceeding their authorities. How do you think they're going to decide, right? And the Chevron deference largely allowed them to both implement these sometimes, I think, very creatively justified rules, and then be the judge that decides whether or not they did it properly. So what I like about the Loper decision is, in my view, this really restores the proper role of the judiciary in deciding legal matters, right? Does Congress respond to that opportunity per se? I think that could go both ways, right? One of the things, Congress might feel like it has a little less to worry about vague language, right? Because it'll be harder for the agencies to exploit it. I think Congress has other bigger problems, and hopefully we'll address that. But in the short run, I wouldn't expect a big change in behavior in Congress. I do think the agencies will start to change their behavior. I think they'll be a little less ambitious in this regard.
I think the most helpful thing here is to start by asking ourselves, why do we get situations where Congress writes ambiguous laws in the first place? Because I think understanding what can come next requires understanding sort of these underlying circumstances. So one answer is that Congress simply lacks the expertise to write laws at any real degree of specificity. And so even if they wanted to, they are at present simply unable to. I also want to make sure we have two other ideas on the table. The first is the notion that ambiguity is sometimes necessary to build the political compromises that you need in order to pass legislation. You simply can't, in some situations, write more detailed laws. If you tried to do so, you simply could not pass them. And then the last idea I want to raise about how we got here is maybe the thorniest one, which is that even a well-resourced, non-gridlocked Congress, simply by virtue of the principal-agent problems inherent in having separate entities write and implement laws, could not preempt every possible source of statutory ambiguity. I think the inevitability of some amount of ambiguity is important for this conversation, because one thing that the majority opinion in Loper-Bright also does is really solidify a world where it's the courts that step in to adjudicate this ambiguity.
I think, Democrats are just saying how bad it is mostly. Haven't really seen much in the way of what should be done about it. Republicans in the House sort of went on a letter-writing blitz. And basically, the approach is to send out letters and say, hey, now that Chevron is gone, you better go back and look at what you did and fix it. Because we know you were getting away with murder before, and now you got to go back and clean up your act. Well, the spirit of that is wrong, Congress. Sorry. Because they're not going to do it. One, maybe you don't really expect them to do it. Maybe the saber rattling is just for its own sake. But really, the thing we need most is for Congress to realize that it's on them to shoulder their constitutional prerogatives. And there's such a tendency for legislators, when they want something done, to write a letter to the executive branch and say, I'm a congressman, listen to me, go do this, with your executive branch authority. And even this, where we say you've been abusing your executive branch authority, the reaction is, you go fix it, executive branch. Sorry, Congress has to take it upon itself to fix it. So I'm a big capacity enthusiast, but I really see it as the first priority is to rekindle a sense of institutional pride on Capitol Hill.
There's a kind of deeper conversation that needs to be had and that legislators are going to have out with one another about the question of do we want this legislative power? Do we want this authority? I mean, James Madison's probably spinning in his grave because he just presumed that people would want to, in the legislature, would want to wield such power. But there are rational reasons for an individual legislators or legislators collectively to back off. One of which is that, say you're a Republican and you feel like, hey, there's a good chance that we might win the White House. I have a policy objective A, B, and C I want achieved. Well, I could go through the grind of the legislative process, or I could just cross my fingers and hope that our guy wins, and then we can ram it through my policies through the rulemaking process. That's a kind of rational, efficient reason for just skipping it. It's also the case that there are some people in Congress who they privilege policy perfection over representative policy. They genuinely prefer experts ensconced in agencies to make decisions rather than Congress, which they look upon as a place full of people of inadequate knowledge and expertise, people who are influenced by special interests. I mean, this is why we have agencies that have been put outside the appropriations process, because there is this belief that, no, Congress is not up to this.
When the case of Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council was decided in 1984, no one thought much of it. And the issue before the court, whether or not the word source in the Clean Air Act for certain stationary source provisions should refer to an individual discrete smokestack or point at which emissions are emitted from, or a larger building or facility as a whole, wasn't a question of technical expertise. Wasn't a question of scientific analysis. It was a policy question. The Reagan administration wanted to define source more broadly because it would make it easier to comply with the Clean Air Act. It would allow for greater flexibility in agency compliance. And the court upheld that because in its view, when it looked at all the relevant sources of statutory interpretation, it didn't think that Congress had answered the question, didn't think Congress had focused on it. It literally wasn't till years later when both some judges on the DC Circuit and officials in the Reagan and then Bush administrations decided that this one paragraph in the opinion, the paragraph that all of my students in administrative law and leg-reg and those sorts of classes pretty much have to memorize, or had to memorize, not anymore, about these two steps, was because of the way it was framed, because of the language used, started to look like a test.
I think we are at a point where we're actively rethinking agency power. And how are agencies responding to this? Well, they're not responding in a vacuum at all, right? They are responding to the broader political environment. Well, there's still, as we've made clear, there's still delegation, there's still rulemaking, and there's still probably some amount of deference, but we can expect agencies to move really slowly, right? They got to figure this thing out, and it's going to take a while, and they're going to have a lot more lawyers involved. So I would also expect the workforce to change a little bit, right? Maybe agencies start hiring even more lawyers. I will say that between 1973 and 2023, the number of lawyers in the federal government quadrupled. So this has been already a trend. We might also see a move towards other actions. So regulation and rulemaking are the focus, but we might see agencies taking up more enforcement actions or adjudication. And we might also see more exits from agencies as career civil servants look at this landscape and say, wow, I thought I was coming into this institution, which for a long time has looked a certain way and might be really different going forward.
One thing I would add, I don't know if this was mentioned before or not, but as I'm sure a lot of people here know, the Supreme Court hasn't relied on Chevron for almost a decade. So that, that's an important kind of baseline setting for thinking about the impact. Lower courts may be a different story. I do think that agencies are not going to be able to do this sort of statute searching thing. That's a sort of immediate change, but how that actually plays out, it's obviously more complicated. What I'm particularly interested to see is what perverse outcomes might result from this. We've talked about how, Chevron itself has generated outcomes that no one really anticipated, and that took time, and so I think, we can think of other examples too, about what courts have decided about what agencies have to do, what kinds of rationales they can use, what kinds of evidence they can appeal to, can change the way agencies operate in ways that can be kind of surprising and unexpected and not always good.